This is The Strange Recital, a podcast about fiction which questions the nature of reality.
Do you ever think about old Jonny Swiggert? Bobby asked me. We were standing under the awning of Sam's all-night coffee and donuts, sipping hot coffee from polystyrene cups. Light rain was falling, and the autumn air had a winter chill to it. A few metres away, over the parapet, the river threw up a misty haze that glistened in the almost darkness. "Sure, I think about Jonny," I answered. "Who doesn't think about Jonny?" "Yeah, I think about Jonny too," Sam said with a yawn. "He used to stop by here several times every night. Liked his coffee without sugar, strong and black. Not like you two sweet-toothed bastards." He laughed as he pulled a cloth from his shoulder and flicked at something imagined on the counter, then returned to rearranging things we couldn't see. "Wonder what happened to him?" Bobby's voice was thoughtful. In reality, old Jonny Swiggert wasn't old. He was about the same age as me and Bobby, in his 40s. We'd all joined the cab company in the same month. That was a good few years ago now. We'd done our training, we had our licenses, we could drive our fares around the city and find our way to any street. "I reckon he just decided to start over," Sam said. "People do that, you know. Like that politician a few years ago. He left his clothes on the beach and vanished. Jonny had a wife and kids and a nice house. Why would he leave all that?" Bobby sipped his coffee. "He had a better life than me, and I wouldn't leave what I've got." I listened to the two of them as they bantered back and forth. It was like this every night. Bobby and Sam got a kick out of antagonizing each other, one taking an opposing stance on any issue the other raised, irrespective of what they really thought. I finished my coffee, slapped a handful of coins onto Sam's counter and left them to it. "Keep the change, Sam," I called as I headed back to my cab. "See you later." I sat and listened to dispatch for a moment or two. It was a quiet night. Then I called in and said I was going to park up on a side street for a while. It was better than wasting diesel by endlessly trawling the streets for drunks and clubbers who just might want a ride, but probably didn't. Talk of Jonny Swiggert made me think more about his disappearance. Neither he nor his cab had been seen in almost 3 years. He'd been a likeable bloke, always smiling, always wanted to pass on news about his kids. A real family man he was. Why would he up and disappear like that? On that point, at least, Bobby was right. Jonny had a good life. Parked beneath a streetlight, my mind wandered, although I can't recall now exactly where it wandered to. Maybe I was thinking of a holiday, a hot Spanish beach, tapas, sangria, and senoritas. Maybe I was thinking of Christmas. More likely, though, I was thinking of sleep. I was startled to awareness by a drunk noisily singing his way along the street. He got to my cab, unzipped his pants and pissed against the wheels. Then he banged on the roof, pressed his face against the window just a few inches from my face, giggled, said sorry, and went on his way again, still singing merrily. Was I disgusted? Was I angry? Of course I was. But if past experience had taught me anything, it was that remonstrating with people in that state achieved nothing. So I quietly seethed for a while and decided it was time to revisit Sam's all-night coffee and donuts. It was 3 a.m. I parked beside the only other cab there. It wasn't Bobby, but old Frank. He really was old, 60 if he was a day, and he was a kind of father figure to all the younger drivers. "Get your coffee and come talk with me, Mike," he said through his open window as I passed. "There ain't anything else doing. I get lonely on these quiet nights." 2 minutes later, I squirmed into the seat beside Frank with a steaming cup of hot sweet coffee in my hand. "You thinking of retiring yet, Frank?" I asked. "What? Me retire? You've got to be joking. What will I do but spend more time indoors with her what complains all the time, about everything?" "Oh, you could take a long holiday, find a hobby." "An holiday? This country's good enough for me, lad. Always has been, always will be. As for an hobby, this is my hobby as well as my work. If I did anything else, I'd grow old and die." I'd met men like Frank before. They thought work was the be-all and end-all of human existence. They had too little imagination to see further than that, too little imagination to dream or yearn for something better. I was talking to Bobby about Jonny earlier. Jonny? You remember Jonny? Him what vanished about 3 years ago, cab and all. Frank was quiet for a few moments, and I imagined his face screwing up in the darkness as he tried to remember. Yes, I remembers Jonny now that you mention him. He let out a long sigh and then breathed in noisily. Strange how he just disappeared like that, never to be seen again. He weren't the first, you know. Happened to a few blokes going back a bit. Mostly they was cabbies, but once or twice other drivers. 6 or 7 since I've been driving. But some of the old-timers when I started used to tell of disappearances too. I've never heard that before. It's true. As true as God's a white man. As true as me sitting here, by Jesus it is. Well, why doesn't someone investigate? The police, the company, someone. Because they gave up investigating. It got them nowhere. Now all those what could investigate just prefer to hush things up. You mean they know where these people vanished to? No, they don't know. That's the trouble. What ain't known about causes people to worry, so better to keep it quiet. So quiet that now they don't even tell the youngsters like you about it. When I got the knowledge, there was 2 parts to the learning. One was to learn the streets of the city that are on the maps. The other was to learn about those that ain't on any map. Those narrow streets and dark alleyways that come alive at night, where no driver, no one in fact, should ever go. You've seen them, we've all seen them. Us older drivers knows about them and know how to avoid them, but youngsters like you blank them out because they ain't part of the knowledge you learned. Well, that's silly, I blurted out without thinking. It's not possible. What you think don't affect what is, sonny boy. What is just is. There's a hidden city inside the city that goes back centuries, and there's something there that no one wants to know. You're making all this up, I said. Tell you what, next time you're at the depot, ask the boss, I mean the big boss, not the dispatcher or some other jumped-up little twerp with power, about the old knowledge, and see what happens. I've got to go now. I got out of Frank's cab, still clutching my cooled coffee. I sipped the coffee, but it was awful. I walked across to Sam, who was rearranging things I couldn't see, flicking imagined things from his counter with a cloth pulled off his shoulder. Warm this up for me, Sam, I said. Cheapskate, Sam said in his usual charming way. Have a fresh cup on me. Why'd you let it get so cool? I was talking to Frank in his cab. He has some silly ideas, you know. You're joking. Sam handed me my coffee. You haven't heard? Heard what? Frank died in his sleep 2 nights ago. He wasn't here. His cab wasn't here. You just stood over there for 20 minutes and let your coffee go cold. I was going to come over and see if you're okay. You're joshing me, Sam, and it's not funny. Honest, I ain't joshing you. Frank died 2 nights ago, and that is that. When I heard how earnest Sam's voice was, I shuddered. I drank my coffee as quickly as I could and thanked him. I'm going to call it a night. There's not much doing anyway. Good night, Sam. Back in my cab, I called dispatch and asked about Frank. He was dead all right. The funeral was in 3 days' time. I started the engine and turned onto the Riverside Road. I crossed the bridge and drove into the heart of the city. Mist was crawling into the streets, and by the time day broke it would be a dull grey morning. But at least the rain had stopped. As I twisted and turned through the old city centre towards home, I noticed alleyways, narrow streets, cuts and snickets I'd never noticed before. Their darkness was so dark, so solid, they were impossible to see into. But something about them called, a siren voice, a beating pulse, come to me, come to me. I managed to stay on the lighted streets. I managed not to turn into the welcoming blackness. Now I understood where Jonny Swiggert had gone, and the others I didn't know. I told you, Frank's voice said, the old knowledge. That was The Knowledge, written by James Goddard and read by me. You know my name. This story is part of a collection of stories called Dolls and Other Brief Tales of Unusual Occurrences in Ordinary Places, by James Goddard, published by Leaky Boot Press, 2019.
Hi, Jim. Welcome to the virtual studio of The Strange Recital.
Thanks, Brent. I'm very happy to be here. I've followed The Strange Recital for a while now and really enjoy listening to most of the stories you put out.
Good.
Especially the ones by Philip K. Dick, of whom I'm a big fan, of course. Do you know anybody who isn't a big fan of Philip K. Dick?
Yeah.
Well, I grew up in London, so the characters in your story were quite familiar to me, as well as the knowledge. That rather arcane and incredibly thorough test for taxi drivers. Archaic in these times of Uber and GPS, maybe. It's a rather beautiful concept that gives me tinges of nostalgia, like Trollope's invention of the letterbox. Was there anything in particular that inspired this story?
As you grew up in London, Tom, you'll realise that getting into a London taxi, or probably a taxi in New York or anywhere else, is an act of absolute trust. Because in reality, you never know where you'll end up. You could end up being taken into the countryside and having your throat slit or something like that. But we trust taxi drivers.
Yeah.
And the knowledge, well, that's, as you say, that's an interesting concept. In fact, it's more than a concept. It actually exists. Taxi drivers are supposed to know London as well as they know the back of their hands. So it's that kind of idea that inspired me to write the story, that we trust taxi drivers. But at the end of the day, where are they taking us?
I've never been there, but I have wandered in the desert canyons of southern Utah, where there are oddly similar tales of people disappearing. So, do the cabbies in London actually tell stories of mysterious disappearances and secret knowledge, or did you invent that?
I've never heard a cabbie actually tell of one of their number disappearing, but I'm sure there are a few examples. As for the secret knowledge, I've never heard of that either, so I guess I must have invented that. Writers do have some kind of license to invent, I suppose. You only have to look at folk tales for stories of people vanishing in sort of strange circumstances, just disappearing. Nobody knows where they went. Nobody knows if they're dead or alive. Some of these folk tales go back centuries, and they exist in all cultures, in all societies.
Yeah.
I've got 2 books of folk tales, large books. One of English folk tales, one of Irish folk tales, and there are numerous accounts within them of strange disappearances and so forth. And they're usually put down to sorcery or witchcraft or the work of the devil. But who knows? I certainly don't.
There's a line in your story which goes, "There's a hidden city inside the city that goes back centuries, and there's something there that no one wants to know." That line really strikes a strange chord with me. Be diminished, maybe. Like this. Now you know what I mean. I once wrote a story about an explorer who set out to find the London within London, a hidden city inside the city, occupying the same space in a slightly different dimension perhaps. Ultimately, he went the way of Jonny Swiggert and disappeared on the Isle of Dogs. I feel maybe there's some synchronous connection between our 2 stories. The dark side of the obvious, perhaps. Does that ring any bells with you?
I'm not a musician, and I don't play an instrument, so musical terms tend to get lost on me a bit. But I can understand what you mean when you say strikes a chord with you, because it's entered the language in a way. The way in which you describe your story, Tom, is exactly the kind of idea I like. There's something hidden in our world, in our cities, and that not everybody knows they're there. In fact, very few of us know they're there. So we don't think about them, we don't know about them. And that is the kind of idea that's contained within the knowledge. I've also used it in another story, an extract of which appears in my book, and that's the story entitled Shadow, which stands alone fairly well as a self-contained piece, but is in actual fact part of a longer story which I'm still writing. So yes, I think there is very definitely a connection between my story and yours.
There at the end of the story, the narrator is driving past narrow streets and alleys he doesn't remember ever seeing before. It's the sudden strangeness of the unfamiliar in a familiar place. But it's really more darkly mysterious than that. I'm reminded of the ancient mnemonic technique of building imaginary architecture in your mind to help you with memorizing large quantities of material. Walking through the streets of memory, you might say. And in the 16th century, some of those memory systems were based on diagrams of hell. So hell is in the mind, and suddenly there's a question. Will the dark, unknown labyrinth of my own subconscious swallow me up?
In some ways, the familiar places are often the strangest places to be, because they evolve, and quite often we don't notice that evolution. And so we'll suddenly become aware of something. It might be at the front of a store, it might be a new building, that we hadn't realised had changed or been erected. That doesn't apply to old streets and alleyways, because they've always been there. Years ago, I used to work in a city, but I lived in the countryside, and it was quite a remote place where I lived. And I used to catch the bus to work, and the bus stop was about 1.5 miles from where I lived. And that walk to the bus stop was through woodland. And on the journey, on the walk, I used to become quite familiar with some of the trees. And I used to use them as kind of milestones on my walk. That was fine in the summer, on light mornings or light evenings. But in the winter, it's totally different. Those trees became something else. They merged with all the other trees into a kind of dark background. And that was when my memory used to play tricks with me.
Brent tells me this story is part of a collection called Dolls, with the subtitle, "And Other Brief Tales of Unusual Occurrences in Ordinary Places." I suppose that description could apply to quite a few of my stories too.
And mine.
So you're questioning the nature of reality, as we like to think we do.
I don't think I'm questioning the nature of reality. I think I'm more questioning perceptions of reality, because I think we all perceive our own reality in a different way. It's something different for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
I've never had a supernatural, in inverted commas, experience, but I've got a number of friends who have experienced odd things, and they've told me about them. And some of those things form the basis of some of the stories in my book, Dolls. They're not supernatural experiences in the sense of ghosts, like the M.R. James ghost stories or Edgar Allan Poe, or anything like that. They're little things, almost inconsequential things often, which rationality tells us couldn't possibly be. The thing about them is that they all take place in familiar places, in a modern house, in a town car park, in an orchard, by a roadside, all the kind of places most of us see every day of our lives.
Yeah.
Maybe this links back to what I said a little earlier about the evolution of the familiar, because perhaps these kind of events, to some, are actually the evolution of their familiar. I think in a way we're all fascinated by these unexplained little events. Even if we don't believe in them, we're still fascinated by them. And I think that's probably why all three of us write about them.
Mm-hmm.
They have a fascination. We'd like to believe perhaps that they're real, even though we don't believe they are.
The inexplicable amongst the mundane. A veneer of realism with an abyss underneath. And I mean abyss in a good way. Tell us where this rather abnormal orientation comes from.
The abyss underneath is probably no more than the place where our memories hide. The things we've forgotten, the things we choose not to remember, until our psyche, or whatever you want to call it, wants us to recall them. When that will be, we'll have no control, of course.
Your book is published by Leaky Boot Press, your own publishing company, which has a substantial catalogue of poetry and fiction books. How did you become a publisher? And what are your views of literary publishing today?
I published my book myself because I'm vain. Or maybe not. Perhaps I am vain, I don't know. I sent it to 2 or 3 other small publishers, and one of them said they'd gladly publish it, but it wouldn't be scheduled before 2021 or 2022. I didn't want to wait that long, so I published it under my own imprint. Maybe that was a mistake, but it's done now. I can live with it. And very few people will read it anyway, so it doesn't matter too much. My first involvement with publishing was a few years ago when I and a group of friends decided to set up a little publishing company. We had access to a novel by quite a well-known British writer that the commercial publishers had rejected, and we told them we'd publish it, so we did. We went on to publish a few books, not a great number, about 12 or 13, all in hardcover editions, which were very nice and generally very well received. Most of them were original books. One or two were reprints, or first hardcover editions, as we like to call them, including Valis by Philip K. Dick. That project eventually ended, and it was quite a few years before I decided to have another go with Leaky Boot Press. And it was only the advent of print-on-demand technology that really made Leaky Boot Press possible, because it makes it financially viable for an individual to have a go at publishing books at least.
Yeah.
My views of literary publishing today are principally that it's accountancy-driven.
Yeah.
It's a profit motive drives it.
Yeah.
That works well enough for established writers, no matter how good or bad they are, and most of them are pretty bad. But it doesn't work very well at all for newcomers, and newcomers have to start somewhere. You know, even Graham Greene or Stephen King had a first book. That accountancy-driven publishing was exactly the reason why I set up Leaky Boot Press. I knew there were a lot of writers and poets out there, many of whom I knew, who had unpublished work. Some friends were showing me stuff that they'd written, and even though they'd published books previously, they couldn't get published. So I said, let me have a look at it. If I like it, I'll publish it. And so Leaky Boot Press came into being.
And it's important to say what is meant by leaky boot.
I picked the name Leaky Boot Press on a whim, really, although it derives from a fairly well-known statue of a young boy holding up a leaking boot that appears in various locations around the world. Nobody knows the exact origin of the statue. According to Wikipedia, it was probably Germany. I like the image because somehow the boot made me think of commercial publishing. The water dripping from it made me think of the authors who have the good sense to escape from that rat race.
Well, thank you, Jim, and we appreciate your contribution to our podcast.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure answering your questions, and even more of a pleasure having my story selected for inclusion on the Strange Recital. I feel quite honoured, I must say.
Yes, keep on writing and publishing.
You keep writing and publishing too, both of you. The world needs mavericks like us. At least I think it does.
Oh, I almost forgot. With this episode, we begin year number 5. Unbelievable.
Should we celebrate?
With masks and social distancing, not much of a party. Maybe I'll just get drunk safely at home, alone.
I think the way it's usually done is that we both open bottles simultaneously while connected by Zoom. But have it your way. I'm going to do a belly flop into my new pool. This is the Strange Recital, celebrating 5,000 years of excellence in a world gone mad. Well, actually, 4 years. Discover us on the web at thestrangerecital.com. The music on this episode was an excerpt from Arabesque No. 1, Andantino con moto by Claude Debussy, one of his earlier works, composed when he was in his 20s. This is episode 20081.